So the first point I want to talk about is the difference between advocacy and lobbying. And this is more than just a question of two different words that mean the same thing. I want to suggest that they do not mean the same thing. They mean very different things. And partly this is just a question of whether you use English or another language. And in my experience, many people whose first language is, for example, French or German, many European people that we deal with, our funding organizations and so on, do not make any distinction between advocacy and lobbying. They think it's exactly the same thing. And that can be a bit of a problem because, well, I'll get to that. Let me first finish the introduction. So the first thing we're going to talk about is advocacy and lobbying and the differences. Then we're going to talk about constitutional and legal approaches to advocacy. And there you'll forgive me because there's a certain amount of overlap in that from what we talked about yesterday, because we prepare these presentations for different purposes. And then the third thing we'll talk about in this workshop is techniques and principles of advocacy. So those are the three major headings. Advocacy or lobbying. Lobbying is often, usually, about what you might call sectional interests, fairly narrow interests. And one of the easiest ways of thinking about this is to bring to mind the classic oil industry lobbyist or the agribusiness lobbyist, the person who is employed by a company to try to persuade politicians and decision makers to do something that the company wants. Allow us to go and put a mine in that place, give us that piece of land because we want to chop down all the trees or whatever. If you look at countries like Nigeria, for example, with a very long history of an oil industry, which has caused incredible environmental damage in the Niger Delta and other places. When there is an oil spill, or when the government tries to crack down on what is happening there, the oil industry brings its lobbyists. They may be lawyers, they may be public relations specialists, whatever, and puts them, sends them to the government to argue, don't enforce this regulation, or we promise we'll fix it next year, whatever. The whole thrust of it is sectional. It's looking after a narrow kind of interest. There are winners and there are losers when it comes to lobbying, because if the lobbyist wins and persuades the government not to take action, someone else is losing. The environment, the local communities, the indigenous people, someone's losing in that equation. It seeks an advantage for me, maybe personally, or my community, or my constituency, and the constituency could be my company, even my country. I mean, you get countries that lobby in organizations like the United Nations or the African Union. A good example of that in Africa was Morocco. Morocco took over Western Sahara when Western Sahara was given independence from Spain. In the 1970s, I think it was the early 1970s, Morocco just said, hey, that's ours. And ever since then, the Sahrawi people have been fighting a liberation struggle to get their country back. Morocco was, in effect, excluded from the African Union for a very long time because the AU took a stance in favor of the independence of Western Sahara. But Morocco then very cleverly lobbied other African countries and the AU to be allowed back in. And it is now, once again, a full member of the AU, and quite a number of countries which previously supported the Sahrawi people have now dropped that support because they rather want to accept help or money or whatever from Morocco. So countries lobby each other even, but mostly it's taking place at the level of commercial interests. Okay. Me, my community, my constituency, my company, my desire to get something that's going to benefit me is what mostly lies behind lobbying. Advocacy, on the other hand, is about speaking on behalf of other people. the root of the word advocacy is from Latin, ad vocare. Vocare means to speak. Ad means to speak to. That's why in court, an advocate speaks to the court on behalf of a client, an accused person or whoever. And in the same way, in public policy advocacy, we are speaking to the authorities, the decision makers, parliament, government, whatever it is, on behalf of other people. And as I said yesterday, hopefully, if we're doing our job correctly, we are speaking on behalf of the common good. But that may be expressed in a particular context as a marginalized community, a poor community, someone who doesn't have their own voice, or who cannot articulate their wishes or their desires or something. The church comes along in the form of a CPLO to speak on behalf of those people, not to promote the interests of the Catholic Church or of the local bishop or whatever, not to promote our own interests as CPLO staff members. We are there to speak on behalf of, shall we say, the community, the wider community. Advocacy is not selfish. It's not competitive in the way that lobbying is competitive. Because you might, for example, have lobbyists from two different companies who both want to get access to that piece of land to drill for oil or something. So it's very much a competitive process. Whereas advocacy is about seeking the common good, not seeking to promote one section above another section in a competitive way. Advocacy is about upholding rights and, as I said, promoting the common good. So almost always when we do a piece of advocacy, that may be, for example, objecting to a new law, which we believe is going to violate people's rights, we take that question, where are the rights in this thing? Where do the rights lie? Are there rights which are being violated, or are there rights which are being upheld? If a piece of law or government policy is going to uphold and promote people's rights, we're going to support it. If it's going to damage their rights, we are going to advocate against it. Many politicians, community leaders, business people speak about land issues, and some of them are genuine advocates who are promoting the land rights of local communities and seeking responsible and inclusive development. They uphold the common good. But others are actually lobbyists, even though they put themselves there as community leaders, even though many politicians will tell you that they are acting, they are serving the people. When you dig a little bit, you find that they are behaving like lobbyists. They are promoting sectional interests, trying to promote the interests of one sector over and above others. And in the process, they ignore or they violate the rights of communities and favor exploitation of land and extraction of natural resources. The examples are obvious, things like the oil industry, agribusiness, extractive forestry. We'll be hearing a lot more about these things in the next couple of days when we go through the CCAM presentations, especially tomorrow and on Thursday. Before I leave this question of advocacy and lobbying, I don't want to overstress this. If you find in your context that people easily speak of lobbying and they mean advocacy, you don't have to have a big argument with them. But in our own minds, to get the distinction right, I think is important. And bear in mind that you will sometimes be accused by the politicians or by others who don't like your advocacy of being a lobbyist. Oh, the Catholic Church is always arguing on behalf of itself, right? Or trying to promote its own interests. In this country, the churches, not just the Catholic Church, but many of the churches are often accused by government when we talk about land issues. They accuse us of having a lot of land that we will not share with the people. It's not true. The only land that the churches in this country own is the land on which the church buildings and the priests' houses and the schools are located. Many years ago, decades ago, Some of the churches had a few farms and a few institutions with land holdings. Almost all of them have long been sold or donated, even some of them donated to the state for land resettlement purposes. The point is, the politicians will try to deflect your criticism by accusing you of lobbying for your own narrow interests. And then it becomes very important to be able to explain that what you're doing is advocacy. You're not there to promote the interests of the church or of a particular diocese or whatever. You are there to promote the interests of the people. And I know not all of you here are working in church organizations necessarily. The same, even if you're working in a secular rights organization, you are there to advocate on behalf of other people. You're not there to promote your own personal rights or your organization's rights. Okay. Second theme I want to talk about then is constitutional and legal approaches to advocacy. As we've said, advocacy identifies and it claims rights. So it's very much based in the law, based in the Bill of Rights in a constitution, based in our understanding of human rights. And it follows a legal, or if you like, a law-centered pathway. It would be a very unusual situation for someone doing public policy advocacy to promote illegal measures or steps. Certainly you would do that if you found yourself in some sort of oppressive regime that itself was not adhering to the rule of law, undermining people's rights. So for example, the advocacy that was undertaken in the days of apartheid sometimes broke the apartheid laws, right? But the apartheid laws themselves were wrong. It was bad law. So to break bad law is not in a moral or ethical sense a bad thing. But if, as in South Africa, we have a legitimate government with free and fair elections, a legitimate constitution, etc., it's difficult to think of a circumstance where advocacy would be justified in deliberately breaking the law. We have a court system. If we're not happy with what the law says or the outcome, we can go to the outcome of a government decision, we can go to court and use the legal pathways to get satisfaction. But as I say, that depends on the legitimacy and the ethics of your government itself. But generally, advocacy follows a law-centered path. Advocacy also demands fairness, justice, and consistency. So you can see from this, advocacy is value-based. Values such as fairness and justice. Consistency also is something of a value. The opposite of this, if we're talking about lobbying is opportunistic. You see an opportunity to make a quick advance for your company or whoever employs you as a lobbyist. You might argue 1 week in a certain way to get what you want, and you find that doesn't work. You come back next week and you argue on a completely different basis. There's not necessarily any consistency to the argument of a lobbyist because it is opportunistic. It's whatever is going to get me an advantage quickly. Whereas the person who's doing genuine advocacy is going to have a consistent argument because it is based on values and it's based on rights. And it may be an argument that is lost, unfortunately. But if we lose our arguments as rights activists, we don't just throw them out the window and come up with a completely different argument. That would be inconsistent. It would mean we're abandoning our values. So these values of fairness, justice, and consistency should be underpinning whatever we do as advocates. When we do advocacy, we are participating in democratic governance. This echoes a little bit what we spoke about yesterday, the participatory democracy idea. doing advocacy on public policy issues and on legislation is an absolutely crucial part of building a participatory democracy. We help to create good laws and policies, or to undo or limit bad laws and policies. That's a lot of what we find ourselves doing in this office. Later on today, when we talk about the submissions that we make to Parliament, we'll go into this in a bit more detail. But it's one of the key purposes of a CPLO is to examine legislation as it comes before Parliament, if it is an area that interests the church, or where the church has something useful to say about it, and ask the question, is this a good law? Is it upholding rights? Is it furthering the common good? If not, then we want to try to undo it, suggest changes, ways that it could be made better, or at least less harmful. So again, you can see with advocacy, there is this value basis, good and bad, these ethical questions come into advocacy. And we hope to build a well-functioning democracy. Okay, so here we just go back into our little graphics from yesterday. The well-functioning democracy where the forces of influence are in the correct kind of balance. If we, on the right-hand side there, where it says civil society and faith community, if we are doing our job well as advocates, we are going to contribute to this well-balanced situation. Whereas conversely, if we are absent, or we are too weak, or we're not doing our job properly, you can see that the people with the money and with the power and with the influence are able to pull the decision makers more towards their side of things. That's basically how it is. This again we saw yesterday, why parliaments matter. They matter because they do these three things. Remember the National Forum for the Public Consideration of Issues, passing of legislation, and overseeing of executive action. In all three of those tasks of Parliament, there are opportunities for us to do advocacy. Probably the most obvious one is in the passing of legislation. Because of that public input system that I showed you yesterday, there are many opportunities for organizations to give input into the legislative process. But we can also do our advocacy when it comes to oversight. You can, for example, write to a parliamentary committee with a complaint. If you feel that a particular government minister or ministry department is not doing their job correctly, you can approach the parliamentary committee and ask them to look into the question. I'm not pretending that it's easy or that they will always respond positively to you, but sometimes they do. And here again, how you package your advocacy becomes quite important. If it's just you as a single individual writing an email to a parliamentary committee, you might not get very far. But if you can persuade the bishop or the president of the bishops' conference or the bishops as a whole to sign that letter, that's very different. If you can band together with a group of other organizations, it becomes a more powerful kind of message. If you can get your advocacy into the media so that it gets coverage on radio, television, newspapers, social media, etc., it again becomes more powerful. So there are various, we'll talk about that more in the techniques, but you shouldn't give up on the possibility of doing this kind of advocacy simply because you feel, well, I'm alone. Okay? There are ways of overcoming that. So let's talk a little bit about the techniques and the principles of advocacy. Let's just keep track of the time. We're going on until 10:30. Okay.
It's important. These are the basics, so we need them.
Yeah. So the first principle that I suggest is Don't see Parliament as the enemy. You're going there to persuade, not to fight with them. And this is something that always kind of amazes me. And I've been doing it for a long time now, since 1997. The number of civil society advocates, good people, the moment that they find themselves sitting in front of a parliamentary committee, they become aggressive or belligerent. It's like, I'm ready for a fight. And sometimes they get a fight. They feel that what they have come to say is going to be unpopular, or that the majority party is not going to accept their view. And therefore they adopt this kind of posture. In our country, there are quite a few organizations, shall we say, whose stance is not sympathetic to the transformational aspects of what the governing party has been trying to do since 1994. Now, and I'm not talking about right-wing apartheid organizations. Most of them don't even bother to do advocacy anymore. They don't come to Parliament, hardly ever, one or two. I'm talking about some fairly good, middle-of-the-road kind of organizations, which have just lost faith in the government. They've lost faith in Parliament. They just have allowed themselves to believe that everything that comes out of Parliament and comes out of government is bad. And therefore they take this antagonistic stance from the first moment. And it really doesn't help them. It doesn't help their advocacy. Now, if we just think for a moment about our own countries, you can probably, each one of you, think in terms of your own country. Do I trust my government? Do I trust everyone in my parliament? Are they legitimate? The elections that were held to put this government in place in Zimbabwe, in Mozambique, wherever, do I really trust that process? The answer is probably never going to be 100%. In fact, it might be 5%. But we've got to be careful about allowing that to influence our advocacy. If we are going to go into those forums, parliaments, legislatures, government forums of one kind and another, and try to do advocacy, we at least have to start on the basis that it is worth trying to persuade those people. Okay? There are many other forms of doing advocacy outside those forums. Demonstrations on the street, getting up petitions, even, you know, the passive resistance. All of those things can also be advocacy. You're doing that on behalf of the common good. You're trying to promote rights of people, etc., etc. But the kind of advocacy we're talking about here on public policy issues and legislative issues, if you are going to do it, then start off as far as possible on a positive footing. You are going in there to persuade people, to try to persuade people, and not immediately to fight with them. The fight might come later. Do respect the institution and its members, and understand and follow its procedures and its conventions. Now, I say again, we mustn't be naive about this. If your parliament, unfortunately, is a sham, your elections are not free and fair, and this body is simply created in order to secure power for a particular party or whatever, then it's silly to talk about respecting the institution. If we think of, I mean, the countries in Africa which have recently undergone military coups, for example, Niger, in Gabon, and so on. One can't talk there about respecting those parliaments because they have now been taken over, in effect, illegitimately through a process like a military coup. If we look at a country like Equatorial Guinea, where the Ngwenya family continually receives 97% of the vote in every election that they have, we can't take that parliament seriously. obviously. But I'm not talking about those situations. I'm talking about basically democratic countries. Yes, we all have degrees of legitimacy, but we've got a workable parliament. If we are going to do advocacy with it, then we've decided it's worthwhile doing advocacy. Therefore, respect that institution, be respectful towards its members. And this is the second part of that sentence is also very important, to understand and follow its procedures and its conventions. It's small things. It's the way that you dress. How do you appear in Parliament? How do you address the members? What do you call them? What is the tone of voice that you adopt? You know, all of those things are important. You're trying to persuade people. You're trying to get them on your side. If you're cheeky, disrespectful, they are unlikely to be sympathetic to what you have to say. So it's that old question. It's the content of what you say and the way in which you say it. Both are important. And again, I often see disrespectful and cheeky people sitting in front of parliamentary committees, just not according them the gravitas and the weight that they have. Remember, in a legitimate democracy, each member of parliament has been voted for by the people. They are people's representatives. That's a very high office, and they deserve to be treated with the necessary respect. Another very important point: don't only complain. We must give praise and support where it is due. I think I mentioned this yesterday. If you come again and again and again with complaints and you're moaning about things and you're unhappy, eventually they won't listen to you anymore. They'll see you walking into the room. Oh, that's so-and-so from the Catholic Church. They only ever come here to complain. And then people switch off. They switch off. They don't hear you. I always give an example to illustrate this of something that happened 20 years ago, more or less. That we had a constitutional amendment to allow for members of parliament to cross the floor, to leave one political party, the one for whom they had been elected to parliament, and join another party, right? It was introduced by the ANC as the governing party. There was a lot of debate about it. Some people felt that individual members of parliament should be able to change parties if they felt that the party itself was no longer doing what it promised to do at the elections. If the party had betrayed its own manifesto and its promises, then in conscience, as a member of parliament, I should be able to join another party, which was more close to what we had promised the people. That was the justification. But the system was rigged in a certain way, and I don't mean illegally. It was done all by in law and all the rest of it, but it was kind of designed, it's a better word, not rigged, designed in a way that really only favored the larger parties. And so there was a lot of resistance from civil society. And when public hearings were held on this amendment, a large number of organizations, probably 25 or so organizations, came to Parliament to make objections against it. We were one of those organizations. Nevertheless, it went through. But it didn't work well. Practically, it was a disaster. And after, I think, 3 years, the government decided, all right, we're going to go back to the old system, which needed another constitutional amendment to undo the first amendment. And so, of course, it had to go through Parliament again as legislation. In other words, government woke up and did what we had asked them 3 years before to do. How many of those 25 organizations came back to Parliament to make a submission to say, thank you, well done, we support this? Only 2. You see, only 2. And I'm happy to say we were one of them. Now, what message did the other 23 send to Parliament? We only came here when we wanted to complain. But when there was an opportunity to support what you were doing, we didn't bother to come. And that is a very commonplace experience, unfortunately. And I don't want to be boastful about this, but over the years, members of parliament from most political parties have noted that the CPLO is an organization which is, in that sense, even-handed. We are ready to support and to endorse and to praise the good things that the government does and that parliament does. And then when we come and we criticize what they're doing, our criticism is taken more seriously. It's respected, precisely because last week we were saying positive things about it. So that balance and even-handedness is very good for your credibility as an advocate. Don't be partisan. In other words, don't become associated with a particular political party or tendency. Don't allow your office to be associated with the governing party or exclusively with the opposition. Now, this is easier said than done, because again, from our own experience, we have been criticized by the ANC for always siding with the opposition, as they put it. And some of the opposition parties, in particular the main opposition party, the Democratic Alliance, on more than one occasion has criticized us for either supporting the ANC or, as they put it, like giving a cloak of respectability from the church's side to what the government is doing. So that they think that we are taking the side of the government. So we get the criticism from both governing party and opposition party. And if you're being criticized from both sides, it probably means that you are more or less correct in the middle. But even so, you need to think in your own political context, in your own countries, how do I get my point across without allowing myself or my organization to be criticized for echoing a political party's position? And it can be sometimes quite tricky. I mean, there can be times when, quite simply, particularly the opposition parties have very good points. Government is doing something which is damaging or harmful to human rights or whatever. And the opposition parties are shouting and screaming about it. You may have to shout and scream about it also. And you cannot avoid using some of the same terminology, for example, or the same examples, the same illustrations. You've just got to be careful. You've got to try to make your arguments in a way that does not depend on or is not endorsed by those political parties. It's also worth remembering, in connection with the last 2 points in particular, governing parties and governments come in for a lot more criticism than opposition parties do, for the simple reason that they are in power. It's the one who is exercising power, the one who is making the policy decisions, that we criticize. There's no point in me criticizing the Inkatha Freedom Party for a law that it made, because it doesn't make laws. It's an opposition party. Okay? If something is going wrong in a municipality and services are not being provided for people, it doesn't make a lot of sense for us to criticize the opposition parties in that municipality, because they're not in charge. They're not in charge of the municipality. They're not making the decisions. It's the governing party in that municipality which must be criticized. As a result of this, we find that 95% of the time we are critiquing the ANC in this country, because it has run the country for 30 years. It runs all the provinces except one. It runs most of the big city municipalities. So, of course, it gets most of the criticism. But if you're sitting in the ANC, and I suppose the same would be true for ZANU-PF and for SWAPO and for all these governing parties, they can start to feel that they are being a little bit victimized because civil society is always criticizing them. So again, you have to make it clear. You're not necessarily taking the side of the opposition. You're not necessarily being a mouthpiece, or hopefully you are definitely not being a mouthpiece for the opposition. It just happens to be the case that if you are in power, you are going to attract the criticism when your decisions go wrong. Simple as that. It's very useful, therefore, if you have a situation, and I'm not sure how common it is, but say in this country, here in the Western Cape, it's the one province which is run where a different party is in power, the Democratic Alliance. And now in a number of our major cities, we either have, like here in Cape Town, also the Democratic Alliance is in charge of this city. And there are coalition governments in some of the other cities, Pretoria, Johannesburg, one or two others. That gives us an opportunity to critique what those parties are doing in the smaller areas where they govern. And that can be quite an important balancing factor to bear in mind. In Zimbabwe, you have a situation where both of the major cities are dominated by the opposition. Right? So again, you could be critiquing what they are doing in terms of the implementation, at least at municipal level, of policies. And that ought to demonstrate to the major governing party in the country that as a church organization, we are even-handed. We will make our criticisms on the basis of principles and values, and not on the basis of who happens to be in power at any one time.
So,
yeah.
Yes, there is something that is coming into my mind right now as we are addressing all these principles. Taking in mind that CPO is one of the Catholic institutions.
Yes.
And then within the same Catholic institutions, we have missions like just politics, of which you find that they are still the same, or they are from the same Catholic Church, and then having their own way of dealing with things.
Yes.
So how do I convince the parliamentarians as a CPO director that are not part of CCDH and not part of culture, because they see us as one thing?
That it's a very good point. It's an important point. We're going to talk about that in the next session when we talk about submissions to Parliament. Okay. Yeah. But remember also what I said earlier about consistency. The consistency when we're doing advocacy is not just consistency of the arguments that we make because they're based on values. It must also be consistent within our organization. And if your organization is the Catholic Church or an interreligious council as in Ethiopia or whatever the case may be, you do have to try to make sure that you're not contradicting what somebody else in the same organization said. Yeah, because then your credibility starts to look very shaky as well. But we'll come back to that later on when we talk about submissions in particular. Okay. Do your research properly. Make sure you understand the legislation or the policy that you are dealing with. I'll give you a very recent example of this, where I made a mistake in a submission just last week, on Wednesday last week. I did a submission, oral submission, on a new piece of legislation to deal with hate speech and hate crimes. And I neglected to see that in the version of the bill that is before the National Council of Provinces now, two very important changes had been made compared to the version that was before the National Assembly last year. I haven't put them on the slides, but basically, when you talk about hate speech and hate crimes, what is the definition of hate speech? The definition that was put in the legislation was anything that causes harm to people. And harm itself was very widely defined as emotional, psychological, physical, financial harm, etc. Now you can see any harm could be just about anything. Any insult or anything that makes me feel a little bit hurt or embarrassed. So we criticize that definition as being far too wide, probably even unconstitutionally so. Last year, National Assembly debated all of those things, and because I didn't check up correctly, I didn't notice that they tightened up that definition very, very significantly, introduced words like severe harm, objective, it's severe and objective harm, and so on. And they brought in, I can't remember, there's a third word which very much narrowed it down. When I made my submission last week to the other House of Parliament, at the very last, the written submission that I sent in still had that criticism of the wide definition. Fortunately, before I started speaking, I spotted it.
Yeah.
And I was able to, again, give praise where it is due and say, thank you for tightening up the definition. But it was embarrassing that my written submission, which was before that, still had the criticism. So that's just an example. Do your research properly and make sure that you understand the legislation. This can become quite an important thing when a bill goes through many different versions, as happens. Certainly in our system, we have had bills that have had 8 or 9 different versions as they make their journey through Parliament. Remember, I said yesterday, if Parliament changes the bill, the minister can withdraw it if the minister doesn't agree with those changes. And maybe a couple of years later, tweaks it a little bit and sends it back to Parliament. So now you've already got 3 versions: the minister's original version, the version that Parliament changed. Now we've got the minister's second version. Then it goes to the National Assembly. They may make further changes. Then it goes to the National Council of Provinces. They may make some changes. So you've got to be on top of your game and, keep an eye on all of these different things. And in particular, try to track whether or not the things that you have suggested in your advocacy have been attended to. All right? Do your research properly. And then be brief, be clear, and be focused. MPs don't have time for long and rambling and confused submissions. I can't tell you again how many times over the years we've seen people appearing before a committee of Parliament, and they come into the room with a big file like this full of pages, and they propose to read this. Sometimes they are very highly paid lawyers who have been engaged by a company or an institution to present argument to Parliament, Now, when you present argument in court within limits, the judge gives you as much time as you need to argue on behalf of your client. But Parliament doesn't. Parliament has a timetable. They say you've got 10 minutes. Or 15 minutes. If you're very lucky, you get 20 minutes. And I've seen people starting to read their submission, and they get to page 5 of 50 pages, and the chairman of the committee says, time's up. You have completely wasted your opportunity. Completely wasted your opportunity. It's also a waste to send in as a written submission a big 100-page document. Members of Parliament are not going to read that. They don't have the time. In our country, and I suspect in many of your countries also, they unfortunately don't always have the education or the background to be able to absorb, densely written, long submissions, academics writing and so on. So brevity and clarity and focus are very important. We'll come back to that again when we talk about submissions later on. It's better to cut down the number of points that you want to make, even if you have to leave a few out, and make sure that you really make those points hit home, rather than that you feel you have to squeeze absolutely everything in. All right, let's summarize. Advocacy versus lobbying. When we do advocacy, we speak on behalf of other people or communities or the common good. We assert their rights. We aim for the common good of everyone. Whereas lobbying, as we said, is much more sectoral, trying to find an advantage, it's competitive, and there are winners and losers. Constitutionally and legally, we follow a law-centered path. We participate in the creation of better laws and policies. When it comes to the techniques and principles, we are seeking to persuade people, not to fight with them. We are balanced. We complain when it's necessary. We praise when it is deserved. We're non-partisan, not identified with particular political parties or ideologies. We're professional, respectful, clear, and focused. I just want to end with a couple of, or one quote, in fact, that I found, which sums up in a certain way the advocacy stance of the church when it comes to particularly the land question. Social teaching of the church condemns the intolerable injustices caused by the misappropriation of land by large landholders or national or international companies, at times with the support of state institutions, which trample every acquired right, and sometimes even legal title to possession, in order to deprive small farmers and indigenous populations of their land. Now, why is that an advocacy statement? Because the church in this assertion is not looking for any advantage for the church. The church isn't asking for land. The church is speaking on behalf of, right at the end there, small farmers and indigenous populations. It's a classic example of how an institution speaks on behalf of others who may not have the resources or the background to be able to speak for themselves. And of course, if you go into Catholic social teaching, into the encyclicals of the popes, etc., this document is from the Pontifical Justice and Peace Commission. You find thousands of examples like this, where over the centuries, certainly over the last 120, 130 years, the Catholic Church has been one of the foremost advocating organizations for the rights of marginalized communities in various ways. Right, that is the presentation.